One man's view of the world, Lee Kuan Yew's perspective on global economy, taken from Chapter 8, Global Economy, What Next? The capitalist system is not fundamentally defective. Despite the growing rhetoric in some quarters, it does not need to be overturned or rebuilt. Given the intensity with which the global financial crisis of 2008 hit the world economy, it is not surprising that we have seen in its aftermath deep contemplation about its causes and what the world needs to do to avoid another such situation. After emerging from a catastrophe, some level of reflection is natural and understandable. However, we should not overreact. There is a tendency for people to assign too much weight to events that occurred recently, especially if they were shocking or emotionally very distressing, such as the 2008 crisis. To reject the capitalist system due to what happened then, or to propose that we henceforth impose stringent controls on the free market are examples of wrong-headed, even dangerous conclusions. We would be throwing out the baby with the bathwater. The vagaries of capitalism are not unfamiliar to us. They have been well documented from the time of Karl Marx. We accept its tendency, given the nature of business cycles, to go to excess because the benefits greatly outweighs the cost. The alternative to it is the straitjacket, as socialist systems have learned quite dramatically over the past century, and to a certain extent, social democracies as well. Our experience during the global financial crisis of 2008 was not a substantial deviation from our earlier understanding of the free market. There was a build-up of imbalances in the subprime mortgage market. America suffered a setback, sending shock waves through Europe and Asia because of the interconnectedness of the global economy. But America has bounced back, and the world economy has recovered along with it. The crisis has exposed underlying problems in Europe, which will take longer to recover. Those problems are related to the continent's currency union and social spending and have nothing to do with capitalism. In the long run, the world is better off and will grow much more quickly under capitalism because the free market is the most efficient way of organizing the productive forces in any society, as history has clearly proven. One key factor that deepened and lengthened the financial and economic crisis for America had nothing to do with the market, mounting public debt. Because government debt had been allowed to build up steadily over the years, there was a loss of confidence in the market after the crisis. This negligent, even cavalier attitude towards public debt and spending was a failure of political leadership, not a failure of the free market. Too big to fail is another criticism leveled at the capitalist system as we know it. Can big corporations, especially banks, really hold their host countries hostage because governments are afraid their collapse will have wider repercussions on the economy? Critics say this induces moral hazard, the taking on of unacceptable risks by these large firms because they know failure would be underwritten by the taxpayer, while success would rake in enormous profits. Although there might be some truth in this line of criticism, the financial crisis of 2008 demonstrated that no company is too big to fail. Lehman Brothers was allowed to fail, despite being the fourth largest investment bank in the United States at the time. There is a federal deposit insurance over funds in individual accounts, but no blanket assurance that all banks will be safe. Would a bigger bank with a more important role in the financial systems have been allowed to close shop? What if it had what if it had not been Lehman Brothers in distress, but say Citibank? I am not convinced that any bank, even Citibank, has a blank check to take unlimited risks. Whether a bank like Citibank gets government help depends on how deep a hole it has dug for itself, whether other banks are in a healthy state, as well as the political climate of the time. The uncertainty over whether the stars will line up in favor of a bank rescue is probably significant enough for bank managers to act responsibly in most cases. That is not to say that the government has no role to play whatsoever. From time to time, human greed gets the better of corporate bosses, prompting them to skew the system in their favor. The challenge for governments is in identifying instances of that happening and taking decisive action against it. Its role is to level the playing field as much as possible so that free competition is also fair competition. The scandal surrounding the fixing of the London interbank offered rate, better known as LIBOR, is one relatively recent example. It involved attempts by banks to manipulate interest rates, compromising the integrity of the banking system to the detriment of other market participants. The chairman and chief executives of Barclays Bank were forced to resign, and the bank was fined hundreds of millions of dollars in America and Britain. This case demonstrates clearly that governments and regulatory authorities cannot afford to let their guard down or to assume that corporate executives will behave ethically when nobody is looking and when huge profits are at stake. Many governments have also been reviewing the regulation of commercial and investment banking after the financial crisis. On this issue, I agree with, in principle, with the former chairman of America's Federal Reserve, Paul Volcker, a very perceptive and experienced man on financial and banking matters, that if we were to draw a line between regular commercial banking and the more speculative, dangerous forms of investment banking, we would have a safer banking system. This has come to be known as the Volcker Rule. In practice, however, it is extremely difficult to implement the rule. Banks would probably move their operations to other countries, and money would flow from countries with the Volcker Rule to countries that do not have it. Britain, for instance, will certainly want to keep regulation on their banks light, given the country's high dependence on London as a financial center. But other countries would want to dampen their competitiveness against Great Britain? I doubt it. When it comes to stabilizing the economic system as a whole, however, government intervention can be both desirable and feasible. The Americans tried to stave off recessionary pressures by pumping liquidity into the economy, essentially printing dollars. A looser monetary policy has been the standard way to fight downturns, although more non-conventional approaches are used this time, and the size of the latest American monetary infusion has been large by historical standards. Not everyone, however, favors this approach. Critics who subscribe to this view of the Austrian economist Friedrich Hayek believe such policies prevent fat in the economy from being trimmed, prolongs the life of inept companies and industries, and ultimately do nothing more than kick the can down the road. Natural adjustments to the economy must come eventually, they say, and blocking that through quantitative easing at best prolongs the necessary adjustment process and at worst builds inefficiencies into the system that will ultimately result in long-term sluggishness, if not a bigger recession later on. I believe having supportive policies, monetary or Keynesian, to deal with the crisis is the lesser of two evils. Many countries tried the Hayekian approach of basically doing nothing during the Great Depression with disastrous consequences. Thanks to the highly integrated global trade system we have in this day and age, the risk of a worldwide tightening with knock-on effects for every continent was a terrifying prospect for all. Nobody, therefore, wanted America to experience a hard landing. The US is able to carry out quantitative easing because its dollar happens to be the world's reserve currency. They're allowed to run a deficit for a long time with very few consequences. If other countries were to do that, they run the risk of capital outflow and exchange rate collapse. The cost is low to the Americans because some of what it would have cost a regular country has been transferred to the rest of the world. The Americans can borrow at more favorable interest rates because of a greater willingness by people elsewhere to hold cash reserves and assets in US dollars. That is the advantage of being the reserve currency. The British used to enjoy the same benefits because the pound was once the currency with which international trade was settled. They have lost that status. Perhaps the Americans will one day lose the status too. I find that difficult to imagine, but it is possible. For now, there is no alternative to the US dollar as the world's reserve currency. The euro is still in peril, and the Chinese yuan is not ready. I do not believe the Chinese are out to displace the Americans. They have larger considerations. If you open your capital account, it means you allow free flow of money. That makes the country vulnerable to, say, a sudden rush in or a sudden exodus that could destabilize the economy. The American system is mature enough to withstand that. I'm not sure the Chinese will want to take on such a risk. What for? They're growing quite well without being the reserve currency. The advantages are not great enough to justify such a risky move. I would not do it if I were them. The French economist Jacques Rueff had been a strong proponent of moving back to the gold standard because he could see the unfairness of a system based on the US dollar. The Americans refused to cooperate, saying you either take my dollar as it is or reject it as you wish. Because America remains the strongest economy, people accept it. An assurance that the present set of arrangements will persist for a foreseeable future also infuses stability and certainty into the international trading system. Any change in reserve currency will probably be marked by at least a brief period of confusion. Even if, and this is a big if, the question is settled amicably among the leaders of all the major economies. For now, the bigger short-term threat to the health of the global economy is a clampdown on free trade. We will always be just one protectionist wave away from a slowdown. We must never forget that the Great Depression of the 1930s was worsened by the isolationist tendencies among several countries. If America's politicians, for example, decide, perhaps out of electoral calculations, to impose a prohibitive tax on the Chinese for selling their goods under cost price, there will be some form of retaliation. Once you go down that road, it would not be long before other trading partners, including Europe and Japan, find themselves pulled into the conflict and having to consider similar measures. Then the whole trade system goes down by several degrees. The world will end up poorer overall. In many cases, it is the poor countries that will be the hardest hit. Starting from lower bases, they stand to gain a lot more from trade proportionally. Free trade arrangements are the way forward. For as long as countries can come to agreement, these deals invariably benefit all signatories. The Doha round of trade talks would have been a great boon for all countries, including Singapore, if they had ended in agreement. Unfortunately, the talks bore no fruit for more than a decade since they started, with agricultural subsidies providing the greatest obstacles to progress. Political will to grant the concessions necessary to make Doha a success is lacking. Some American workers have suffered from offshoring, and the politicians have found it difficult to make a case to them that more adjustment would be beneficial. Of course, if the American companies do not offshore, the Germans, French, and British and Japanese will, placing them at a disadvantage. Of course, if the American companies do not offshore, the Germans, French, and Japanese will, placing them at a disadvantage. In the meantime, most countries have quite understandably been busy working towards bilateral free trade agreements, the second prize but a prize nonetheless. To date, Singapore has signed 19 regional and bilateral free trade agreements, including FTAs with major economies such as the United States, China, Japan, India, and Australia. As it turned out, these FTAs have been drivers of trade liberalizations in light of the Doha impasse. Our strategy paid off. The Trans-Pacific Partnership, a high-quality trade agreement among countries surrounding the Pacific Ocean, is also a welcome development. If the 12 countries presently engaged in talks can seriously commit to opening up their domestic markets, the agreement will help bring the trade to the next level, deepening benefits to tens of thousands of companies and hundreds of millions of consumers. With the Americans agreeing to participate, the Trans-Pacific Partnership will certainly be a worthwhile proposition for all countries involved.